Man-made tunnel connecting Juarez in Mexico to El Paso, Texas.
This is one of the most sophisticated tunnels we've seen.
The sudden closure of the Texas border by federal officials blindsided the nation, freezing commerce, halting travel, and sending shockwaves through communities that rely on daily crossings. Highways to major ports of entry turned into parking lots. Border towns went quiet except for the chop of helicopter rotors, and questions multiplied by the hour. What could force a shutdown this sweeping, this fast? It was not a spike in migrant crossings, and it was not a simple political gesture, at least not directly. The trigger was buried below the surface, beneath sunburnt soil along a lesser-known bend of the Rio Grande, hidden in plain sight the whole time. During what should have been a routine sweep in an area known for smuggling, Border Patrol officers noticed subsidence patterns that did not match recent weather or river flow. A section of ground gave way. What looked like a collapsed culvert turned out to be the mouth of something far larger. And here is your first cliffhanger, because what came next reframed the entire border debate. Before we get deeper, hit like and subscribe, because the details you are about to hear will change how you think about national security, infrastructure, and what it actually means to have a border. This was not a crude crawlspace hacked through rock for a quick run of contraband. Agents found a labyrinth, corridors reinforced with steel ribs, ventilation shafts disguised as erosion gullies, electrical cable tucked into conduit and routed with professional care, junction boxes labeled with internal codes. The network extended for miles beneath the US-Mexico line. It did not feel improvised. It felt engineered. And it was not just a tunnel, it was an installation. Multiple chambers with server racks, encrypted radios on charging stations, battery arrays wired to custom inverters, ration storage, water filtration, medical supplies arranged in neat rows, sleeping bays that suggested shifts, not temporary camping. Someone planned for permanence. Authorities sealed the area immediately, then widened the cordon. The FBI, DHS, and the Army Corps of Engineers arrived with ground-penetrating radar and borehole cameras. As teams mapped the network, the discoveries grew more troubling. Technical drawings taped to concrete pillars, topographic maps with color keys and symbols that corresponded to relay points, logs written in shorthand that referenced movement schedules and equipment checks. Early analysis dated some activity more than a decade back. That is right, a decade. All while attention and funding focused almost entirely on what could be seen above ground. And then came the twist that pushed this beyond smuggling. In a checkpoint chamber the size of a two-car garage, investigators found biometric scanners, not at the entrance but inside, positioned like an internal gate. Facial recognition software had recorded comings and goings. The immediate questions were obvious. Who was being tracked? Why maintain a roster at all? And who controlled that data? Cyber teams imaged drives and pulled partial logs from damaged servers. Even the fragments painted a picture that did not align with a single purpose. Terms like asset drop, coordination node, and infiltration rehearsal appeared in multiple directories, with dates spread across years. Some entries referenced activity spikes during major national distractions, for example hurricanes, election crises, and high-profile trials. While the country watched one headline, the underground project appears to have advanced another step. File that away because it will matter later. Back in Washington, a regional state of emergency came first, then a quiet elevation of the national threat posture. Advisors briefed the president. Interagency task forces formed in hours, not weeks. If this existed beneath Texas, could comparable networks sit under Arizona, New Mexico, or California? Had anyone already moved through these corridors and vanished into the interior? Here is your next cliffhanger. The answer would determine whether this was a crisis of place or a crisis of scale. On the ground, the human and economic cost of the shutdown hit fast. Long-haul trucks idled for days with perishables on board. Farm cooperatives scrambled for temporary cold storage. Day laborers who crossed before sunrise could not reach job sites and lost wages they count on. Small shops that rely on cross-border foot traffic closed early, then closed again the next day, with handwritten signs taped to their doors. Panic buying flared in some towns as rumors raced ahead of facts. This event felt different to locals, heavier, more serious, like an alarm clock that would not shut off. Lawmakers demanded open hearings. Committees subpoenaed briefers from intelligence and engineering agencies. Some of the political commentary aimed at the administration, some at long-standing policy gaps that spanned multiple presidencies. But outside the Capitol, the debate felt less partisan and more personal. People wanted to know how something this large could operate under their feet without notice. How do you build a city corridor by corridor and keep it hidden? Engineers continued to map. That map did not flatten fears. Branches radiated outward, some dead-ending, others veering towards sensitive surface sites. One spur ran in the direction of a power substation. Another angled toward a regional airport boundary. A third intersected utility corridors that carry water and fiber. Now ask yourself this: if a network can reach critical nodes without ever breaching the surface, what does deterrence even look like? In one chamber, investigators found scaled mock-ups of surface facilities. Foam board, resin, and 3D printed components arranged like models you would see in a planning office. Only these were built for practice, not presentation. Paths were labeled with numbers that matched the shorthand found on maps. The clear implication was rehearsal, not only planning on paper, but physical run-throughs in a controlled environment. Linguistic teams examined markings scratched into beams and painted on conduit. Spanish appeared, also English, along with Russian characters, Arabic script, and Mandarin notes. Some symbols matched cartel tags. Others looked like cipher markers known from foreign intelligence tradecraft. Nothing on its own proved a single sponsor. Together it suggested a hybrid. Picture a shadow coalition where logistics expertise from organized crime overlaps with engineering know-how from rogue contractors, with outside capital smoothing the edges. Not a hierarchy, more like a marketplace of capabilities. Financial forensics followed serial numbers on gear and procurement footprints for specialized materials. The trail threaded through shell companies in the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. Payments split into small transfers that recombined through booking agencies and equipment brokers. None of this is novel in isolation. Taken together, it hints at patient financing designed to be boring on purpose, so it never trips an automated alarm. Now for a harder turn. Environmental monitoring flagged a pattern that turned a security crisis into a potential public health risk. Several segments of the network ran close to important groundwater reserves. Geologists warned that any leak, even a slow one, could spread contaminants through aquifers that serve towns and farms far from the border itself. The EPA and Department of the Interior joined FEMA and DHS at the command table. Soil cores and water samples were pulled on a rolling schedule. This was no longer just about people moving through space. It was about the stability of the land and water that communities depend on. Teams cataloged supply caches hidden under false floors, fiber optics, hardened steel panels, encryption hardware, medical kits with inventory logs, sealed rations with shelf life markers stretching 10 years or more. Someone anticipated long-duration activity with minimal resupply. Another chamber held atmospheric test equipment and seals that would allow isolation of air in a confined space. Trace residue on swabs indicated chemical precursors, not active agents, but enough to elevate the response and bring in additional oversight from allied partners. That single detail reset risk calculations overnight. Media coverage ramped up, even as official statements stayed narrow. Leaked photos showed concrete arches, narrow-gauge rail carts, and blast doors with mechanical locks. Commentators argued over whether this proved a foreign hand, or whether modern cartels have simply become more corporate and more technically capable than many assume. That debate matters less than a simpler observation. The network was designed to survive discovery. Depth, curvature, and reinforcement made conventional demolition risky. Flooding could compromise nearby foundations. In other words, even the exit strategy had been engineered. Meanwhile, daily life adapted. Utility crews audited past projects for odd sensor readings that might have been dismissed at the time. County surveyors rechecked permits that involved excavation, looking for anomalies in soil reports. Ranchers reported low rumbling at night in places where there should be none. Some calls proved unfounded. None were ignored. False positives are a tax communities will pay when certainty is scarce. Let's address motive. Smuggling remains an obvious use. Move high-value product or people with low exposure, you gain margin. But the presence of maps, models, and rehearsals aimed at critical infrastructure points to something beyond commerce. It points to leverage, the ability to threaten power, aviation, water, data, and movement without surface visibility changes bargaining power in any conflict, whether criminal, ideological, or geopolitical. That is not a Hollywood plot. That is risk math. Some of the recovered digital references point to coordination nodes outside the immediate border region. Not active tunnels necessarily, but relay points and safe sites in cities well beyond Texas. The question is not whether such nodes exist. The question is how many, and how to distinguish rumor from signal without burning precious time. That is where analysis meets patience, and where public appetite for instant answers collides with the slow work of verification. As weeks stretched into months, parts of the border reopened on a limited basis for essential trade. Other segments remained closed. Concrete poured into known shafts, while robotic scouts probed for voids. Crews worked at night to reduce surface disruption. Every new find required a judgment call. Fill it and risk unintended consequences in nearby soil. Leave it and risk use by actors you have not yet identified. There are few clean choices when the problem sits beneath your feet. Community life adjusted around the edges. Churches organized supply drives for families missing wages. Schools revised bus routes to avoid active work zones. Small papers printed pull-out explainers on how ground sensors work. People do what they always do in extended emergencies. They normalize the abnormal because routine is how you breathe when the news is heavy. As weeks stretched into months, parts of the border reopened on a limited basis for essential trade. Other segments remained closed. Concrete poured into known shafts, while robotic scouts probed for voids. Crews worked at night to reduce surface disruption. Every new find required a judgment call. Fill it and risk unintended consequences in nearby soil. Leave it and risk use by actors you have not yet identified. There are few clean choices when the problem sits beneath your feet. Community life adjusted around the edges. Churches organized supply drives for families missing wages. Schools revised bus routes to avoid active work zones. Small papers printed pull-out explainers on how ground sensors work. People do what they always do in extended emergencies. They normalize the abnormal because routine is how you breathe when the news is heavy. For now, sections of the border will reopen under tighter control, with more checks, more sensors, and more cooperation across agencies than most people will ever see. The work is not cinematic. It is slow and technical, and it matters. Because here is the truth that kept surfacing in interview after interview with people who study this domain. Not every threat shouts. Some threats whisper. Not every breach happens in the cloud. Some breaches are dug one shovelful at a time. And if you want to defend a country, you have to learn to hear both.